So what are your questions? Any thoughts on making the best of a bad situation? How does it strike you as a way to summarize the Dharma? I thought it was rather shocking, but also quite to the point in some very profound ways.
Bad situation, that's a really good summary of my mind. Bad situation is a good summary of the state.
Is that on? Push the little. There's a little obscure button.
A bad situation is a good summary of my state of mind.
Mm.
So making the best of that.
Yeah, that's good, very good. I think you might be engaged in a bit of one-sided hyperbole, but Bob.
Well, I had thought about my intention for my practice and actually my life is to somehow bloom where I'm planted. So that's almost the same kind of idea. Mm-hmm. And to consider, and I don't have to, but letting go of my own suffering. And that I'm quite attached to, and the habits that create my own suffering, because I seem to play those stories out. I mean, I was sharing with Linda at break, I don't know how you got into my head this morning at the gym. I go to the gym instead of practice in the morning for my couple, my spouse, for a long time just to keep our earth suits physically healthy. But my earth suit was experiencing a lot of pain this morning, and not according to my preference. And I watched my mind just get really have an attack of PMS, pissing, moaning, and sniveling. and I watched my mind become more and more unhappy, and about that, and proved that being in the human body sucks and everything's hopeless and it's all going downhill quickly. And I going, oh dear. Yeah, so it was interesting to, as you mentioned about habits of my own mind, there are 2 or 3 things on earth that when I really think about it, at least 2 or 3, that I'm deeply troubled by and I really don't like at all. And I just wish they'd stop and go away. But they don't seem to. And I watch my mind as it encounters these circumstances or these situations, both in myself, my family, my friends, in the world. I can notice that resistance comes up to them. And when I'm in the field of resistance and story making, I have a great world-class story maker who lives in my head and comes up with all kinds of discussions and evaluations of what is arising that is just arising. It truly is the world's karma, my family's karma, my friend's karma, even Bob's karma. Can you imagine? And I have a lot of really beneficial karma arising, so I'm really, really grateful for the lineage of teachers at KCC, and Venerable Chodron say, you know, you ought to go see Michael Conklin because we don't have a center in, in Portland. And so I'm glad she did that many, many years ago. You know, that suggestion led me here and led to a lot of healing and encountering the 7-point mind training and many beneficial things. But sometimes it's discouraging when you've had Dharma practice for many years and still I can be carried away by an attack of PMS. And so I guess this is a comment on my humble frustration about sometimes as I watch my trust and my belief in my Buddha nature diminish, and I somehow sometimes forget. So I really appreciated all your reminders, as you started this, because it was exactly what I needed the wisdom to say, sweetheart, this is samsara, dear. And you heard that all things are impermanent and sickness, aging, and death is present here, and you will not avoid it. But you can cultivate deep love and compassion and kindness and actually your very best self. So even in the midst of all these things, which at one level I don't like, at another level I can grow acceptance and contentment and peace. And I've heard rumors about this, and I actually have it sometimes, but other times I wonder, where did you go? Car 54, where are you? So
Do you have a question embedded in this? Because
How do you?
pretty soon, I'm not going to be able to hold the context.
Well, so what do you do when an attack of PMS comes over your mind? And you've had many years of practice.
Well, I generally, that's what you see in the rear view mirror, is the pissing, sniveling, and moaning.
Yeah.
So that's what it is. And then what do you do? It's not what you do so much to avoid it. Mainly, I indulge in it for a while. So
Even you?
I'm just checking in to see. Oh,
Yes.
yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. That I ran that story for a while, didn't I? Oh, yeah. It's that's the game. We just have to pick up when we discover it, when we realize what we're doing, then we have to actually pick ourselves up again. It's no different. It's just it's the same as that instant of calm abiding when we discover we're distracted. Instead of being distracted from just a more subtle aspect of attention, we're distracted from all our aspirations and also that basic ability. We've lost track of the basic ability to just let go of something. And sometimes, so if you talked recently about the question of like, do I actually want to let this go?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's,
Am I willing?
Yeah, am I willing to let this go? During meditation, it's actually, you can see the, you're getting all warmed up. The autobiographer is in full tilt, and the prose is flowing so well, and you really want to know how this chapter of your life will be presented. And then somebody reminds you that you should take a then something, the equivalent of that happens, and then you're reminded that you need to take a station break.
Sweetheart, you're on the road to hell again. If you
A
continue.
station break for the public service announcement that says you're actually, the underlying situation here is you're not paying attention to those things. It could get you more in touch with your Buddha nature as opposed to less in touch. And it's good to have a particular thing in mind. And this is one of the key elements in the mind training teachings, the approach in the mind training teaching with all the aphorisms that you develop some familiarity with, so that you have one thing to do, not a generic sense of there must be something to do. Or there are many things that I ought to try, which is,
Don't do it.
and then there's kind of gridlock. So just trying to have one move, just one move. And sometimes it can be something subtle, like you just realize, actually I could completely let go of this. It's not consequential. The other times when the biography says, no, this is actually where the most important drama of your life is being played out right now. So you really have to pay attention to me. Then you sometimes need to have a debate with the biographer and say, no, let's look at the facts here.
When I let go, it all faded away, so I was very grateful. Yeah, so I did that.
But about that debate, Geshe Kelsang once said to us, just let them dance in front of you, which was very helpful. Like, let them dance, you're just watching the show. And I think that's, what were we talking about? Oh, Lama Mike was talking about today. If you are in the conflict, in it, you're not going to be able to help end it till you can get out of it. So I think when Geshe-la said that, it gave some space, like, oh, you know, like Bill said, sometimes you got to just let them kind of debate a little. And then you kind of see, change the channel, you know. This is going nowhere. But not getting so tight, you know, making space. Yeah.
I think that I really appreciate that teaching of making the best of a bad situation, and I think I've thought about that a lot for a long time, and I really believe in it. I think I've got a fairly, what seems to me a pretty worthwhile perspective on it. I think the part I'm struggling with is when it seems like that it can feel like sometimes endorsement of something bad in a way. You know, I'm thinking of like when you're in a conflict where, say there's somebody who is, you know, bullying someone else somehow, or, you know, in some way being, you know, oppressive or prejudiced. And it's expected maybe, you know, that we'll just kind of go along nicely. You know, maybe it's, you know, a family member's significant other, or, you know, there's some situation where it's not very easy to just leave, you know, the conflict. And that there's, I think, even like maybe pressure or an expectation to kind of just be nice, go along, you know, and kind of make the best of the bad situation, that feels to me like endorsing of the you know, in that example, yeah, like the bullying or oppressive or cruel behavior, and I struggle with that because I feel like you know, almost every fiber in my being doesn't want to do that, doesn't want to make the best of the bad situation. And I mean, at that point, I start to struggle with what that even is. Like, I find myself,
that's good.
Yeah, wanting to like confront it, take it on, even fight it, you know. And so at that point, I start asking myself, like, what is the making the best of the bad situation, and how does that differ from maybe fighting it, or is fighting it in that case making it worse? That's where I struggle with that particular teaching.
It is a struggle. It is a struggle. There's no question about it. I said this not to try to make something easy or to point out that this was the answer to everything in some kind of ordinary sense. It is a struggle, and the struggle is dealing with all the things that you just brought up. And part of it really boils down to, we have to run experiments. And we have to run experiments with great honesty in our own stream of being, and great honesty about what actually happens when we try out different kinds of things. And we have to think about them long term as well. What kind of seeds, even if we, quote, fought something and, quote, won, what seeds did we plant? And what will we have to do with those? Because that will be the next bad situation. But I am not in any way, shape, or form advocating just smiling and nodding. Anybody who has seen me on my not so public persona of trying to look like a good person, anybody who's seen me, and that will know that I do get wrapped up in things. I'm passionate about things. I get carried away. But in those situations, you always have to look to see what I'm running an experiment, whether I want to run it or not. But am I willing to look at the data? Am I actually willing to look at the results? And then, because it's an experiment no matter how you slice it. We don't know how it's going to turn out. And that reminds me of a story that Anthony told about a meeting of the Dalai Lama with a number of heads of organizations. Oxfam was one, and there were a bunch of other, maybe Amnesty International, and a bunch of people who respond to disasters. And they asked him all these soul-searching questions because they have been relatively honest with themselves about, well, we went to Haiti and we thought we'd try this instead of that, but this didn't have the same results as that we tried before, but it also didn't turn out the way that we hoped, and we can see that we actually introduced certain kinds of major problems. And so they sort of asking him kind of, what should we do? Well, what should we do? And part of his answer was, I think I see part of the problem here. You want to know how it's going to turn out before you do anything. And that we never really get a chance to tell that. We make our best guess on what we think is going to be helpful, but honesty, really kind of penetrating honesty, is actually is the most important thing, and honesty with ourselves about how did that actually turn out, and what are the seeds? How are the seeds growing a year out? What does the relationship look like 6 months later, 5 years later? And in that, I think, then we begin to find out just how we can engage our energy. And this is something that we talk about quite often, because there are lots of situations where being nice is actually the opposite of being kind. Being quiet and agreeable is the opposite of being compassionate. So there isn't a way to figure it out beforehand in a certain way. You have to look and check and use your best informed decision making based on what you've understood and what you want to try, without any certainty that it's the right way to do things. It's just what I'm going to try. This is what I'm going to try now. I'm going to try to interrupt this conversation where somebody's carrying on and on and on in this whatever way you want to characterize it, that I don't think is actually good in the long run if I just let it run. I'm going to interrupt this conversation with my own public service announcement. How do I do that? And what do I say? How much concern can I carry for the impact on the individual that I'm interrupting? What would that actually look like? It's not easy. But I definitely, I want to propose kind of leaning, in a certain way, leaning away from the notion of kind of a passive engagement in that kind of situation. Because I think we actually need the experience of running the experiments, but we need to be super, super honest. And perhaps go places afterwards to check in ways that we're not always comfortable with either. To have a conversation with somebody that you've just created a certain kind of friction. What do you do next time you see them? Do you write them off? Say, well, I blew them away with my really clever critique of that rationale. So, done. It's not like that. Mm-hmm. What do we do? What do we do next time? It's not simple.
I just, it reminds me of this kind of, well, it's a teaching out of conflict resolution that conflict, you know, let's just say samsara, our situations, that's the norm. We're going to have them. But we tend to fall into one of two ditches. And you kind of described them in your question, Joe, which was we go nice and avoid, you know, we totally avoid, just, okay, bye, you know, or we blow the person away, you know, like kapow. And because we only know those two ditches, then they feed each other. Because every time we experiment, we only know use the Uzi, you know, or we only know don't say anything. And those feed each other. Because we use the Uzi, then we're afraid the next time to say anything. And, you know, we don't say anything, the pressure builds up, and we pull out the big guns. So these feed each other, and there's tons of creative room in the middle, tons that we don't explore. And so I'm really like totally with Bill, explore there, you know. And of course, you're gonna try to bring your compassion, your common sense, your care into that exploration. And of course, you're gonna blow it a lot of times. But there are times when it's just amazingly elegant playing in that middle field. And the more we can play there with caring about every person involved, the one that appears like a nasty racist, let's say, the one that is appearing as a victim of that, us appearing as some kind of hero or ally that's going to step in, you know. But there has to be compassion for everybody, everybody. I mean, there doesn't have to be, but it works if there is. So it's kind of fun to play in there. I can only say that after doing about 500 divorce mediations. The first 100, not fun. After that, it was kind of like, this is really interesting, you know. I mean, like, here's a creative one. My trainer was magnificent, older guy who'd done these for years. And I was describing to him a first session in which I was quite new, and I said, well, and then the woman stood up and slammed the door and walked out. And he said, that's the beginning of the conversation. And I thought, wow, I thought that was all over. And he said, no, she's telling something. She's telling something. So then you check in, you don't give up. Like Bill said, do you write that off? Do you say, you know? Or do you, you know, wait a couple days and write a note and say, do you still want to talk, or are you really done? Or what would it take for you to feel safe here or heard here? Or, you know, there's room. And we don't know that room because of our habit of blasting or silence. Mm-hmm. And the silence isn't silent. We're building, you know, like a double boiler that just, the lid finally just blows off. That's what we know in this culture. Mm-hmm. And we just go back and forth. So it's really important to just imagine there's a lot of room in the middle even. Just imagine that and play there. So all your questions were spot on. That's starting to look at what's in there. What would be the best? What would even be good? Forget the best. Yeah.
In this case, sometimes when we use the word compassion, we're actually using it. We should, as Buddhists, be using the word compassion in a much deeper and broader sense than the way it's often used, which it does actually tend towards the poor you.
That's not compassion.
No.
Get away.
See, that's you know, the pouring our own private
Syrup.
all over everybody else. So when we talk about this and we talk about having compassion for everybody involved, we really have to think about it in terms of that wish to unravel all the causes of suffering. That is actually, that's kind of not just the superficial ones, not just the ones that we can see right up front, but to really hold the wish to, that however we engage in here, may it unravel at least some of this stuff, but keeping our eye on the deeper piece of it.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question. It has to be the wish for the end of the suffering of everyone. So if we're looking at our political situation, the wish for the suffering of everyone. The leader of North Korea, the leader of the United States. And we don't do it that way, generally. And then we just add to the suffering. Whenever we leave anyone out, first of all, we've blown our bodhisattva vow. And secondly, we will only add to the suffering because we start getting on sides. Sides are a problem in themselves. The right side, the wrong side. The winners, the losers.
Can I just ask you to clarify that part? Because I think that's the part I struggle with is it's like, it's not even necessarily like that I'm going to brilliantly like defeat the person. I actually might bet against that, actually, like not seeming like I'm going to blow them away. Actually, I'm maybe going to sort of be the loser, you know. But what's the difference between being principled and compassionate in that broad sense, and not, being quiet or nice, to say cruelty. What's the difference between that and what you just said about if we go the wrong way, we're violating our bodhisattva vow? Like how do we how do we make the best of the bad situation even when it's not going to look very kind necessarily, but it still is in keeping with the bodhisattva, the vow, even if there isn't any brilliant stroke to be struck, like in that.
You have to run the experiment.
Yeah, that's what I was
You
just
have
gonna
to
say.
run the experiment.
Try it.
And there's some principles like holding everyone kind of in a field of equanimity. But when that becomes, that can become an abstraction that becomes an obstacle to actually running the experiment. Because we want to we want to go back to knowing how it's going to turn out and knowing that we're going to do it the right way. We actually have to do the experiment.
Have you ever had a time where someone appeared to be unkind and it was very helpful to you?
In a sense, yeah. I mean, ultimately, like it could make me more experienced and stronger.
Yeah.
Or yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, and that's what I think we're talking about. I'm not sure if this is quite where you're getting at, but I had this really amazing fundamental Christian boss one time. He was really Christian in the best sense, like he lived it, and therefore was a great supervisor for me. And at one point, I had to get very tough with an employee of mine who was just acting out and really causing chaos in the whole mediation place. And I didn't want to do it. It was so hard for me to do because it wasn't nice. And because he had a following, and I thought they won't like me, which turned out to be true. And he said to me, you have to, in order to lead, and I think in this sense I would say lead ourselves out of samsara, lead others, you have to give up on people liking you. That shocked me. I hated that, because people liking me is really important to me. It's probably been one of my life's goals. and when he said it, I just couldn't believe it. I thought, God, as a leader, I thought, you know, you want everyone to like you, then you can lead them. He said, no, it doesn't work that way. You figure out what's the right way to go. Like, let's say, you know, doing the Dharma practice or speaking up for a oppressive comment. And then you do it. You run the experiment. And he said, some will like you, some won't like you, and some won't care. And this is true all the time. And every time I've run an experiment, that's how it falls out. Some people like you, what you did. They'll come up and say, wow, that was great. Some people say, oh, I didn't like that at all. And other people are just out the door on their merry way. They're not thinking one more second. But the point is, that can't be our standard. It has to be doing the right thing. I know it's dangerous to say the right thing, but you know what I mean. The thing within our ethics, within our bodhisattva intention, vow, etc. So that's where we go. And the other thing I think about is, you know, something Lama Michael has said to me more than once when I get confused. Practice now for your next life. I also didn't like hearing that, because I want to practice now to be happy now. But he said, don't worry about it. You practice now for your next life, and then everything will work out now. That also seems to come out true. So it's about kind of understanding what your values are, what your deepest heart wish is, and going for that. And people will fall out wherever they are. I have different friends now than when I started Dharma. For that same reason, I didn't cut them off, but they just didn't want to go where I was going. And it was like, just kind of naturally, because I didn't want to keep hanging out at the bars or, you know, whatever. So it's like that, you know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you.
So I've been noticing. Excuse me. I've been noticing lately how much my mind, my thoughts, my attitudes, what I do, what I don't do, what I say, what I don't say, has to do with my gender, the body I was born into, the culture I was born into, and the way that gender is held. And it's not just for me, it's my mother and her mother and her mother, and all the way back into times that were overtly much more gender-based than the time we live in now. So I've been noticing this. It's pretty, you know, it's very deep. And I'd like to be really aware of it, because I feel like getting free must include getting free of that, you know, of that whole program around gender. And so when, I'm also pretty sensitive to it. And so when I hear just a joke, and I know it's just meant as a joke, like PMS is pissing, moaning, and sniveling. That's it, you know, that's it. That's the subtle marginalizing of the experience of a group of people based on gender. That's how I hear it, you know. And I guess I wanted to say something about it because I wonder if there is a place, and I know there is a place here at KCC to kind of bring some consciousness on how it is that we organize ourselves and others, our expectations of them, our thoughts about them, and ourselves based on gender. And so I don't know that I have a question other than does that sound is this a place where we can kind of consciously consider and talk about that? I know I brought it up in different groups and meetings and such, and it you know, I know that when we're enlightened, this doesn't make a any difference whatsoever. It's just a non-issue. But we're not, and it feels like an important issue. And so I guess I just wanted to say something about that. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that. The phrase tonight didn't hit me that way, but other things certainly do. And I just had a flash of running an experiment, as Bill's saying, where some practice, everywhere where we say he, we just say she, and see what that's like for people. Like go through a sadhana or something, and everywhere where it says he, we say she, and see what that's like. Because I sometimes read my text that way, so that I'll feel spoken to, So, there are many kinds of experiments, but yeah, we've talked that we have all men up here, except for Tara. So, and it's not about good and bad or guilt or anything, but it's an experience for us. So I'm glad you experienced what you did and you spoke about it. Yeah.
Yeah. When you speak of going beyond the programming, I think that's quite true. I don't know that we know what it looks like to do that. And I'm thinking about the difference between the type of analysis and conclusions that we make at kind of a cultural and societal level of cultural and societal critique in our current culture, the difference between that and the sense of going beyond programming, which actually includes the notion that we have this external construct, this eternal external reality that exists independent of ourselves. And that's an even more challenging level of programming. So there's a whole continuum in there, and I think it is important to be open to looking at all of these things as an evolving conversation. That, I think, is very important. The thing that always makes me nervous is when it sounds like there is an arrived at wisdom in this kind of conversation. Then I think we wind up solidifying something else. And then we've lost track of the inquiry, we've lost track of the possibilities, and then we have kind of whoever speaks is willing to speak more and has a more articulate way of expressing something, that becomes kind of the center of gravity. And it's tricky. It's very tricky. There are a lot of ways in which it's accepted to speak of the ways that, just in terms that you did, the subtle marginalization, which is, and I have no disagreement about what you've said about that. There are ways in which it's not as common to speak about masculine roles and the dynamic play of them. And when it is done, then a lot of times it's done only kind of in the context of having already started to talk about female gender roles, and then it starts to become a kind of derivative in terms of that conversation and in terms of the kind of some of the ethical and psychological pieces in that, and then something I think gets lost in the middle there. So I think it is important to talk about these things, but I think it's important to talk about them in ways that press the inquiry farther. And I would, one of my experiences,
More inclusive.
yeah, more
Wider.
inclusive, wider. One of my experiences, well, part of my experience in being part of the Dharma Center is tonight's kind of not quite there, but usually I'm in the company of 3 women for every other man that I'm in the company with in most Dharma situations. And when it gets actually down to doing the actual work to make this center functioning, it's more like 10 to 1. So it's a very skewed kind of experience, and I have some sense of what it's like to kind of sit on the periphery of that dynamic, and very rarely have a chance to see what it's like when you have mainly Dharma men taking responsibility for something. And that was something that we had the opportunity to see a little bit about that, not by any kind of constructed intention, but just because that's who we wound up with. It was more 10 to 1 the other way. And seeing some of the dynamics that occurred in that, it was very interesting. It was a different flow, it was a different feel, but I also felt the influence of Dharma inquiry in that. So there's a dance here that I think is really rich.
Yeah, I really love what you said about inquiry, and not knowing where a discussion is going, but just being with it. For me, it's watching my own mind. And so thank you.
Stan.
About this, this experimentation and not knowing where it's going. That sounds great for 99% of the time, maybe. But I'm thinking of a particular person in my life that I care very much about, who is extremely reactive, a kind of person that if you say the wrong word, it's all over. And so not wanting to experiment too much.
Yeah.
And wondering if you have any advice or observations on that kind of situation.
Well, when I said run experiments, I didn't say roll the dice and and then look at the tarot book and see which thing to try out today. So it's a much more constrained experiment when you feel like the stakes are really high. but the same principles are there in terms of how can I act in this situation where whatever it is I do or say will become a solvent for confusion and that nexus of confusion suffering that goes together, where they're really it's two in one. So how to become a solvent for that, and in really difficult situations like that, there aren't a lot of pages in the book devoted to how to pull that off easily. There's the joy of cooking up solutions to samsaric situations does not include many recipes for that. It's just, but it's the same thing. The notion of running the experiment, you have to just take it that you always are. It's just really whether do we look at the data or not? Do we actually look? Do we actually really observe ourselves well? Do we observe other person well in the moment? Do we see how it unfolds over time?
But yeah, it's just very hard to let go of caring about the outcome when the danger is that the outcome could be quite disastrous.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm not actually advocating not caring about the outcome.
It was not knowing the outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, not
Yes.
knowing the outcome.
Yeah.
Yes.
Different.
Yeah, they're very different, and we can care deeply about the outcome and admit that we are not actually going to be able to predict it 100%.
Would it be fair to say that you're running the experiment all the time by doing nothing?
Yes,
Yeah, that's part of it.
Ryan said you're doing the experiment even when you're doing, quote, nothing. So I wasn't doing anything. This is, from kind of a karmic perspective, this is a real slapstick. This is vaudeville to say that I'm not doing anything. I didn't do nothing.
Because we're always in relationship, always. Yeah. We're totally interdependent. I'll tell you one experiment I run with that, and it's had some success to my surprise, is I imagine that person when I'm meditating there next to me, and I just do whatever mantra I'm into that night, Buddha pouring light on us, Vajrasattva, whoever, and that's all I do. I just kind of turn it all over, like I haven't got a clue. That's what I say. I haven't got a clue what to do here, but I can try and love the person at least that much, and I don't want to sound like I don't know why this works, but more than once, maybe 4 or 5 times with different people, I've done this, and the next time I see them, something has shifted. Now, maybe I'm acting different. I don't know. Maybe I wasn't paying attention, but something went to the better. Tiny, not huge. But it's like, oh, that's interesting. I think I'll do that one again. And it doesn't cost me anything. Yeah.
So that sounds like a good alternative to trying to do Tonglen.
Yeah.
Sometimes that Tonglen doesn't quite make it.
Yeah, Tonglen can feel too hard when you're feeling oppositional or frightened or anxious because it feels so. And so that's what I do. I just sit there, and a teacher taught me that. I didn't make it up. Seems quite helpful. At least I get up from the cushion feeling more peaceful. So maybe that's what shifted. I don't know.
There are many things that shift in that, and I think that's we can do any practice with that kind of in that framework, and very often we are encouraged to do this if somebody's passed away.
Yeah.
But it can be any kind of circumstance to bring somebody, and then you just kind of do your best practice.
And they're there.
And they're there. And part of it is that the intention. Right now, I'm going to work on being a kind of a solvent for my own confusion. So I will work on being a solvent on my own confusion while holding their presence.
And then
And
give
that-
it all to them.
and-
Just give it. Or to
And
the
that,
end
that
of
actually
the
shifts
conflict.
things,
Yeah.
because that gets it takes us out of the frame of reference to kind of parsing out the strategy for how we're, exactly which and particularly if we think people are very reactive, we have engaged in a kind of massive aggression, a subtle but very massive aggression that holds them in a certain way.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about sort of abandoning our intelligence and our sense of history, but when we're actually holding them in that perspective, it does something. And when we actually just sit with them and cultivate the ability to just sit with them, it does something else. And when we talk about suffering, the kind of the brief refresher on the three types of suffering. There's the coarse suffering, and if we see somebody who's highly reactive, we can easily identify that, when they're screaming and yelling, they're obviously in emotional turmoil, and it's not good for me or them or anybody else. Easy to see. We don't actually see the more subtle levels that actually are in are the skeleton. They're the bones of that external display, and to be able to step into our own confusion and see how we try to hold things as stable. Even the notion of holding the stability of the idea of my friend is a very reactive person. I got that one settled. But it's actually, there's a kind of violence to reality that's going on in that. And so we're able to sit with our own grasping after stability and sit through that. And then to be able to actually start to see that fundamental kernel of anxiety and distress, the kind of the sense, it's the cosmic sense of what we'd said when we were kids, when we were sitting in the car and say, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And we knew the answer was no. But that sense of, that subtle sense, so being able to kind of dissolve as much of that, then when we're with people, then we are the solvent.
Mm-hmm.
The more that we can see into that, the more we can carry some kind of flexibility.
Space.
Space.
Make space.
It's really, yeah. And Vajrayana practice is a whole way to step into that kind of with all 4 feet. I'll leave it there. So we can dedicate our conversation and our practice. By this virtue may I quickly realize Mahamudra and establish all beings without exception in this state.
Thank you.
Merci
Thank
beaucoup.
you.